Well, Jackie, the weather is lovely here now, but earlier there were thunderstorms, which Southern Water has blamed in part for the reason why they had to release waste into the sea. They said, given the dry weather recently, the parched ground couldn't absorb the heavy rainfall, and so their systems got overwhelmed. They also added that they're working to reduce the amount of rainfall entering the sewers by 2030. But of course, that's of little comfort to some of those who have swam in contaminated water over the last few days. We spoke with a group of horrified swimmers earlier who had no idea what they'd been swimming next to. Another swimmer who was in the water yesterday told us the conditions were horrible and reminded us that this is one of the only free exercises that they can do while people are feeling the pinch. But as you mentioned, it isn't just here. Around 50 beaches across England and Wales have had contamination warnings. We started our day here in a much rainier Seaford.
Even on the greyest of days, the shores of the south coast are alluring. But there's hidden dangers today. Just metres from the shore, brown bubbles of sewage splutter out into the sea in the town of Seaford.
So what we can see is the sewage outflow pipe Southern Water use on occasion, sometimes after storms. And what we can see is that there's been sewage coming out of that pipe.
The council say it's not just unpleasant for people, but can be dangerous too.
This is a beach used by many swimmers, many residents. It's a public space and people come here all of the time. So we are worried about the health impacts of having sewage in the seawater.
Warnings are in place across much of the south coast of England not to venture into the sea because of the pollution being pumped out after heavy rainfall. But not everyone is heeding the advice.
My mum has said we're not allowed to put our faces in because it's really dirty. So, it kind of has stopped us.
So you're just being super careful?
Super careful, yes.
What's happening here is perfectly legal. Water companies are allowed to discharge into rivers and seas when there's a risk of pipes overflowing. But the criticism is that it happens too often, not just when there's been heavy rain, but light rain too, and that there hasn't been enough investment in infrastructure to stop it from being needed.
Last year, Southern Water were fined a record £90 million after admitting deliberately dumping vast amounts of sewage into the sea across the south coast. They say storm releases like this yesterday were done to protect homes and that the releases are 95% rainwater. The practice was used across England this week. Official data gathered by the environmental group Surfers Against Sewage show nearly 50 beaches have pollution warnings, mostly concentrated along the south. But beaches in Lincolnshire, Lancashire, Norfolk, Northumberland and Cumbria have also been contaminated. Charlie swims several times a week in Brighton, but after falling ill on multiple occasions, now avoids the sea when there's a chance it'll be contaminated.
I tend to feel a bit like a bit of a mild fever, feel a bit sick in your stomach, and that can last an afternoon or a couple of days. The broader issue is just about how it makes you feel when you've got that beautiful thing there, which has just been, ravaged and ruined, and to see that happen in front of you. 2022, it's incredibly depressing.
There's likely to be more discharges over the coming days as heavy rainfall hits the region. At least 6 London Underground stations were underwater this afternoon. This outside King's Cross train station, where people desperately try to keep the drains unblocked. But the downpours have done little to replenish the reservoirs. Today, Thames Water became the 6th water company to announce a hosepipe ban after the record heatwave this summer. With the extreme weather of recent weeks a window into the future, how we manage our water has become more important than ever.
Well, no one from the government was available to do an interview, but earlier I spoke to Philip Dunn, the Conservative MP who is the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. I asked him if he accepted the claim by some companies that discharging water and sewage into our rivers and seas is a necessary trade-off to relieve pressure on houses and businesses.
Well, I think what all of this shows us, the problems that we've had, both in flooding, the amount of rainfall that we're getting as a result of climate change impacting right across the country, and the way in which our water companies are coming under so much pressure to cope with the increasing volumes of human sewage that we're generating all the time, is that we need to have another look at the way in which we manage water right across the system. And I think what we've seen in this significant swing from dry to flood conditions in a matter of days or hours even, is that we've got to look after our water more carefully. And I think one of the challenges, frankly, for the new government will be to look at how do we prioritise managing our water.
I mean, many people will say you're being extremely kind to the water companies, but despite the fines, the threats being made to the water companies, the government seems impotent to act to stop them discharging sewage.
Well, I don't think anybody will accuse me of being kind to the water companies. I chaired the committee in Parliament that did this significant report, which came out at the beginning of this year, and during the course of last year was imposing, with the help of the government and Parliament, additional requirements through the Environment Act, which came into force last November. And one of the provisions of that act is that by September of this year, so in a couple of weeks' time, the government will be obliged to produce a report into how they're going to cope with the sewage overflow and discharges plan and the plans of the individual water companies. So there's a great deal more focus and pressure coming onto water companies to resolve the way in which they treat water, and our committee has played a reasonable part in bringing that about.
I mean, you talk about being tough on the water companies. The Environment Agency seems to have reached the end of its patience with the water companies. It was saying in July that top executives should face jail when there are serious incidents of pollution. Would you accept that that's perhaps the only way that you will see real change?
Well, I think we've got a number of different pressure points coming into bear on the water companies at the moment and on the regulators. So the Office of Environmental Protection have announced that they're looking at the way in which the water companies have been regulated. The regulators themselves announced last November an inquiry into, I think initially 5 and now it may be 6 water companies in the way in which they've operated against their permits. So that in itself will, I suspect, show that a number of water companies have persistently breached their permit limits. And it will be up to the regulators then to decide what penalties they impose or measures they require water companies to deal with. And they have indicated that directors' bonuses are in the frame. And as you've said, they've also talked in terms of corporate sanctions. And so I think there's all options
you
are
talk
open.
You talk absolutely about persistent breaches, and that is a fact, isn't it? So the environmental campaigner Fergal Sharkey says the government has effectively granted a certificate to the water industry to profiteer from environmental destruction. Which bit of that claim is not true in your view?
Well, I have a lot of time for Fergal. He's appeared before my committee, but I think what he's talking about here is the way in which water companies were able to, I think what he's talking about, it was to self-monitor their performance on discharges from water treatment plants in particular. And the problem here is that none of this it'd be great to wave a magic wand and wish all of these discharges away. But that cannot happen. This is going to take years because it requires considerable infrastructure investment.
Philip Dunn, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.